another episode of Ghost History Medium. This is our investigation reveal for location number 12, which was Sailors Snug Harbor in Staten Island, New York. Now, the history of this place is so rich. It goes back almost 200 years at this point. And because there is so much information available, and I've picked up on many different individuals and aspects of this location, I'm actually doing 2 different investigation reveals for this because it would be too long to do all in one go. So for the first reveal, we're going to talk about the Sailors Snug Harbor, Robert Richard Randall, the chapel, murder-suicide in 1863. We're going to talk about the Snugs, William Billy Bradish, and the 1880 scaffold tragedy. And then for the second reveal, I'm going to go into underwater telescopes and Colton lights, Civil War and U-boat submarines, the matron house, the woman walking the grounds, an 1867 murder of a cook, Cottage Row, and death on stairs. So stay tuned for the second reveal, but first, let's start off with Sailors Snug Harbor and Robert Richard Randall. All right, like usual, let's orient ourselves to where we were actually doing our location reading. So Sailors Snug Harbor, as you can see, is on the north side of Staten Island, and Staten Island is just south and west of Long Island and Manhattan, and New Jersey, you can see, is on the left. Now, a little closer up on the right-hand side is a more modern-day Google map search, and you can see the grounds that are still available to the public today in the middle, and you can see Cottage Row that dissects it, and a bunch of other streets on the right-hand side. Here's an even closer up map of where we were doing our location reading. So the 3 stars are where we actually stopped to record, and the star on the right is the chapel, the star in the middle is the matron house, and the star on the left is one of the cottages on Cottage Row. And as you can see, there's 5 buildings in the front there in blue, and those are the historic buildings that are registered today. They're kind of in a Greek revival style, and they were built in the late 1800s, and they sit there facing the river, which is the Kill Von Cole. This is a picture of a well-known postcard showing what the Sailors Snug Harbor looked like back in the day. And as you can see, the 5 Greek revival buildings. You can also see there's a very large building on the left with a dome. That was the Memorial Church. That is no longer there. It did burn down. And all the way in the back of this image, you can see an X building. That's the sanatorium or the hospital. It's no longer there. It was demolished. The street on the right is Cottage Row, and Cottage Row leads right up to where the port was, where sailors could come and go, and also visitors could come and go to Staten Island from this area as well. So who is the mastermind behind creating this massive area with these extremely intricate Greek revival buildings that are really stark on the landscape? Well, his name is Robert Richard Randall, and he was born in 1750 and he passed away in 1801. He was the son of Thomas Randall, and both of them were very well-known privateer merchants in New England and New York area. And when Robert Richard Randall died, he actually wrote into his will that his money, because he wasn't married and had no children, was going to be used to create a charity foundation, which was the first of its kind, to maintain and support aged, decrepit, and worn-out sailors. That literally was the entire purpose of Sailors Snug Harbor. And the man who is said to have created the will was actually Alexander Hamilton. And, this happened in 1801. It took a while for them to really figure out where they wanted to have this location for sailors. There was some legal stuff that they had to figure out. And it wasn't until 1833 is when they first had sailors come and live on the property. It started with about 37 sailors, and it just completely escalated from there. And the reason why there was such a need for a place like this is because back then there was no Social Security. Nowadays, when individuals get old and they're no longer to work, they worked into the Social Security system. But back then, there was none of this. Not only that, sailors really didn't have a home. They lived on the ocean. They lived on the sea. The ships were their home. They also didn't have families as often as people who lived on land because, they traveled all over the world and didn't have a set location. So when these men were no longer able to work on the water, they didn't have a place to go. Often they were destitute and poor. Sometimes they were even injured because obviously being a sailor is a very strenuous, difficult job. And it was so kind that Robert Richard Randall, being a sea captain, recognized the need that his sailors had and was able to provide a foundation that could supply a wonderful, secure, caring home for the men who worked so many years on the water. It was so interesting that the first place that I was brought to by spirit here, and they kind of grabbed my arm and brought me to this location, which is very interesting because there are rumors of a man in this area that people do ask for directions and help actually right around the chapel. So it's very interesting that there was somebody who took my arm and took me here. But what's so fascinating is this is the original chapel that was here. And as you can see, there's this box on the right-hand side with a bit of a scroll. That is actually the resting place of Robert Richard Randall today. And, it was incredible that the first place I went to was the place where the founding father is buried. Not only that, but I did mention something about the 1820s and 1830s, and that was the time when this location actually began. And this is just a close-up view of what the front of the seal looks like on his grave. Okay, well, now that we're at the chapel, let's talk about the chapel and this murder-suicide from 1863. The chapel was built in 1855, and it's had multiple reverends from the time of its beginning, and it's also had multiple denominations. They used to have services there every Sunday, and at one point in time, Snugs were required to go to service even if it wasn't their denomination, and they actually could get punished if they didn't go to service. While I was here, I did a fairly long reading, which was not really expected, and I got a lot of information, but the first thing I'm going to start with is the movie Gangs of New York, because I really think it was a significant clue as to what did happen here. Okay, so Gangs of New York was a movie that came out in 2002. It's set in the southern Manhattan in 1846 to 1863. It is about gang wars, and it was mostly about William Bill the Butcher versus Priest Valor. The Butcher kills Priest Valor, and then his son, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, goes on a revenge fest. Now, the end of the movie actually depicts the beginning of the Civil War and how it was portrayed and received in Manhattan at the time. So the Civil War started in 1861, and that's when the North were fighting the South. And in 1863, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and also initiated a draft regulation. The ending movie fight scene of Gangs of New York were actually taking place during a significant event in New York City called the New York City Draft Riots. It's actually one of the most notorious riots in American history to this day. It took place in July 13th through the 16th of 1863. And why I think this is so interesting that this movie, Gangs of New York, which had a significant ending fight scene in 1863, that was also revolving around gangs killing a priest, is because January 31st, 1863, an actual murder and suicide was documented at Sailors Snug Harbor at that spot we were at. And the murder took place that same year. And it was actually a inmate or a snug or a sailor who's living there, they have multiple names, shot the chaplain. And it's supposed that he shot him because he thought that the Reverend was going to expose him for something else that he did, another murder or something else that he might have confessed to him. So this is an actual documented event that happened on this property in that spot in the newspapers. And this is the gravesite of the Reverend Robert A. Quinn on the right-hand side. And again, it states that he died at Sailors Snug Harbor in 1863. As a little side note, I'm just going to say that it was so fascinating to me how Spirit brought forward this movie that I knew culturally and I could recall it to try and get my attention to an event that happened there. You know, I can't always predict, well, I can never predict really what Spirit is going to bring to me and how they're going to bring to me. And sometimes it's really puzzle pieces of putting together the information. But they did a really good job of getting this movie to me because it did bring me back to the year and the theme of a priest getting murdered in 1863. So I was really floored and really amazed at that. All right, let's move on to Snugs, William Billy Bradish, and the 1880 scaffold tragedy. This is one of my favorite pictures I could find of the men who lived on this property. This is about from the late 1800s, and it depicts a bunch of snugs. So snugs were also known as inmates, and they were also known as jacks. And they came here, like I said before, in their older age for care and for just ending out their years. I also love these pictures too. So in their free time, which they had a lot of free time because they were pretty much all retired and older, they would make nets or baskets or weavings. They would also go to the front of the pier and fish, or they might just take a nap on a bench. Remember how I was describing the Snugs wearing dark uniform? I said it was navy blue or black. Well, this is actually a picture of an original uniform, and it's in the Noble Maritime Museum that we went to after our investigation. And each inmate was entitled to 2 suits, one a summer one and a winter one. But you can see there are a lot of buttons on this, so I'm not sure where I was getting that there weren't any buttons, but definitely was a dark blue, even black uniform that they all had to wear. Each one of the Snugs did have to submit an application to be accepted. Once they were accepted, they all got the title of captains. It was interesting they said that they were admirals of the inlet. I couldn't find any documentation or information that they called themselves that at all. But they were definitely all called captains, and that could be for real captains, that could be for first mates, second mates, or just deckhands. These are some articles that I found depicting kind of what the population looked like at this time, and this was in 1873, and also decreed by Robert Richard Randall. There was no discrimination for age, there was no discrimination for race or religion, so all men were accepted. There were African Americans, there were individuals from all over the world. The only requirement was that you had to be a sailor, you could be a military sailor, you could also be a private merchant. Most of the individuals were private merchants, but many of them did have a history of being in many of the different wars that we had during this time. So this shows that captains and first and second mates, carpenters, also the majority of inmates are the following nationalities: American, English, Irish, Scottish, German, and different nationalities numbered 31. It also says that inmates were of all ages, and the average age of the inmates was 55 years. One other thing I was able to find to kind of prove the ages and where Snugs came from was online. There is a record of burials here from the years 1887 to 1903. And in the small section I took out from the see last names, you can see there's a gentleman who passed away when he was only 23. But you can also see there's a 90-year-old, 72, 59, 66. So they were definitely of varying ages. Now, most of the men were, in their 50s to 80s, but I did find a few in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. One other validating piece of information I was able to find and could explain why I was seeing even younger children in their teens was there was an orphanage on the property, and this orphanage was for children of deceased sailors, and they were kept there until they were 17 years of age. And by the time of 1853, there were 99 children, boys and girls, and up until 1885, there were 160. So this was a thriving orphanage, and actually this orphanage is still in existence. It's just not on this property any longer. I was really excited about these finds because when I was there at the location, I kept seeing men of all different ages and fit in their 50s. I definitely saw younger individuals and I saw older. I also saw different nationalities, and I couldn't really pick out one or the other. And this information just really validates that for me. I did want to go into a little bit about the governors who ran this place. Governors were at the very top. There are multiple governors, but one of the more famous governors and individuals who had the most impression on this place was Governor Thomas Melville, and he was there from 1867 to 1884, and most of the buildings that are present today were built during that time or renovated during that time. This was also a period when it was updated and it became a lot more, he did a lot of sanitization and upgrading into the modern era. But one other thing that Thomas Melville also started was a ledger, and he was the only governor to keep a daily log. And remember, the sailor was telling me about keeping a daily log and the weather. Now, Thomas Melville also started the practice that each one of the inmates, when they wanted to leave the property, had to get permission from him. And this is a cartoon of that process on the right, showing that these sailors, and you can also see that they depicted one of the sailors with a wooden leg, and which there were sailors there that had wooden legs. I've seen pictures of them. I should have put one in here, but anyway, they had to give their leave notice, and Governor Thomas Melville had to approve it. And this is a process of sailors checking in and checking out, and that's exactly what that ledger, that man was talking to me about. While all governors kind of had some contention with the inmates because of regulation and rules, Thomas Melville was generally liked, although there were disagreements. That's in contrast to the next governor, Governor Trask, who was pretty much disliked by every single inmate and everybody who ran the place. Governor Trask was so disliked that he was even shot at by an inmate at one point in time, and he was saved by having a lot of newspapers in his breast pocket that stopped the bullet. So, yeah, it was tough to be a governor, but Trask was really disliked. On this plaque, it says that he ran it from 1881 to 1898. Now, I also saw references that it was from 1884 because 1884 was the year that Thomas Melville died, and Thomas Melville died on the property. So at some point in time between 1881 and 1884, Governor Trask ran it. He's also credited with creating a process of tabooing, and tabooing was when an inmate did something bad and had to be punished. Tabooing generally was they would have their tobacco rights revoked, or they could also have their rights revoked of going off and on the property. When it got really bad, they were actually kicked out. That didn't happen very often, but there is some rumor that Trask did this willy-nilly, and that kind of put a lot of inmates on edge. So some general rules of the place: you couldn't be drunk, and they also lived in dorm rooms. The whole place was dorms, and they were generally living together, which, you know, as individuals who lived in the ocean in close quarters, it probably wasn't that much different. The picture on the left is an actual image of two inmates in their room together, and the picture on the right is one we took when we went to the Naval Maritime Museum. There's actually a replica of what one of the rooms looked like back then. By all accounts that I could read, it did seem like the sailors had a really good life here. They had ample ground to walk around, they were able to come and go, and once they got older, there was a place for them to go for nursing care and their eventual passing. There's also a cemetery on the property, and this cemetery is called Monkey Hill. It's estimated that between 7,000 and 10,000 inmates have passed away here and are buried there. There are a few gravestones still standing in the cemetery today, but what actually was done was when they passed away, a number was stamped on a stone, and the stone was then put over their grave. All of these stones were removed to prevent vandalism. So all of these cemetery stones are actually held in one of the buildings in Snug Harbor. This is a picture of some of those stones in the Naval Maritime Museum that you can go visit today. Now, the story of the man who I think was telling me the majority of the information about this place was, he was giving me a name of Bradish, Bernard, Bald, and then he said his nickname was Billy. And fascinatingly enough, I was able to go back into those records that I again showed you earlier of the cemetery records from 1887 to 1903. And there is a man named William F. Bradish, who was 54 years old, from New York, who died in 1888, and his grave number was 1534. Billy is a nickname for William, and the age matches the individual who I saw talking to me. This would also have been a man who would have been about the age of an individual who was serving in the Civil War. And we're going to get into all those stories about the Civil War, about the lights and the underwater telescope that were used at that time for submarines, because we're going to get into that in the next video. But I was absolutely floored to be able to find this individual who did come to me and tell me his name. It was so impressive that he was able to do that. And from this record, we know that he lived and died at Sailors Snug Harbor. So the other individual that was prominent and kind of around me at this time that was giving me a lot of body pain on my back, and it felt like a pole had hit me or something had hit me, maybe broke my back. But anyway, so that kind of lines up with an incident that happened June 28th, 1880. There was a falling scaffold incident when 5 men were employed at the new building on Sailors Snug Harbor at New Brighton, which is where we were thrown to the ground 20 feet by a falling scaffold. 3 were probably fatally and 1 severely injured, and the 5th was uninjured. Now, I didn't really know what scaffolds looked like back then, but this is a picture on the left showing scaffolding circa 1900s, and there are poles. They probably would have been wooden at that time, and wooden planks. It's definitely possible that one of these fell, smashed a guy in the back, and threw him to the ground, and he died, and that was the younger individual that was coming to me, giving me this body pain. It also makes sense because the area where there were a lot of construction during this time of 1880 was in Building E. You know, there was a lot of construction all over the place during this time because this was a period when they were doing a lot of expansion. But definitely I could find records of Building E being constructed in 1880. And the star, again, is where we were doing our investigation. So it's really not that far. And he definitely could have come over to speak to me and tell me his story. All right, so that wraps up for our investigation reveal number 1. Stay tuned for part 2.